Hey guys, this is Pastor Caleb, and welcome to our new Thursday night series as we get into answers for some of life's more difficult questions. On Thursday nights, we're going to be starting a series here with Professor or Dr. Sean McDowell. We got his permission. He is an apologetics professor over at Biola. Some of you guys might know his dad, Josh McDowell, who wrote a really famous book. Um, Sean has been putting out content weekly for a long time, and I have just been a great fan of some of the discussions, the guests, the people that he brings on, because I feel like he really is trying to equip us, the church, with resources for how we can engage in the world. August, we're going to do a Thursday night series where each week we're going to put out one of these discussions or interviews that he's done and try to equip you so that we can be salt and light, so that we can be ready to give an answer to the hope that we have. I hope that you're blessed. I hope that you enjoy these on Thursday nights, and then we can follow up if you have questions, if you have prayer requests. You can always text the church, 714-879-3314. We'll also include a link to Sean's YouTube channel where you can find hundreds of videos on everything from how to share your faith to topics like these to a whole bunch of different resources that he has there on his channel. Again, we hope that you're blessed. We hope that you enjoy this, and we hope that you'll join us on Sunday mornings at 10 and 12 as we continue to unfold God's word to answer life's most difficult questions. All right.
Habermas has possibly studied the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus more than anyone who's ever lived. In his endorsement, Michael Licona, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, says there's only one person alive who knows more about the resurrection than Gary, and that's Jesus. Here's some questions we're going to explore. How has this study personally changed him? What does he think about the Shroud of Turin? What does he think about the evidence for near-death experiences, and does this contribute to the case for the resurrection? And what does he think about the cognitive dissonance theory, which was not included in depth in Volume 2, but many skeptics say this is one of the leading alternative theories. Dr. Habermas has finished writing all 4 volumes of On the Resurrection. 3 are published, and he's here to talk about it. Gary, thanks for coming back on.
Sean, I'm glad to be with you. And while you're talking about Volume 4, when I'm doing the editing before I got on with you, and I'll go right back to you when I get off. It's the editing of Volume 4 is difficult.
Well, thank you for your time. I can't wait to dive into that one. Right now, the 3 volumes that are out, I weighed them last night, Gary, and they are 13.2 pounds. That's what the 3 of them together. I've got all 3 right here, which is incredible. I'm going to hold them up. Volume 3 just came out, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. But I have kind of a combination of some personal questions for you, kind of the backstory, and then some academic questions. But if we can, let me just start with this broad one. It's possible, maybe probably, you study the resurrection more than anybody. How has this changed you?
Tremendously, only it didn't start that way. Now, in a previous broadcast, you and I talked about my doubts, and that's what led me to it. I went on for almost 24 years in doubt. And one day I opened up a book. It was a little tiny Bible commentary for lay people. And that's what I was in those days. And I read the sentence, if God raised Jesus from the dead, he must be who he says he was, because God wouldn't raise a heretic. And I thought, that's beautiful. That's great. But I don't know anything about the resurrection. So the resurrection has to happen for this sentence to be true. And that launched the study. It took me a long time. In fact, a lot of people know this. I've told the story, but after my PhD, I only say this so people don't think I was 10 years old or 15 years old when this happened, but after my PhD was the struggle that I've talked about with Buddhism, not proper Buddhism, but the argument that says Buddhism is the proper metaphysical view for modern physics. And I got into it quite deeply. And Sean, I will always remember the night I got up, it was late, I was working, probably midnight, and I said to myself, wow, Is there any chance I already crossed the line? And I dropped down on my knees by the couch in my living room, and I confessed to the Lord that I would even start to study something so stupid. And after that, I took notes and I wrote about 35 refutations of that view. It's still in the back of the book that influenced me. And since then, been moving forward. And I will tell you one answer to your question is this. As time goes on, it's almost like, all right, the resurrection's there. I'll never forget it. I always work on it. But now my heart's desire is for ministry. So the biggest influence is not if the resurrection is all this, but since the resurrection is all this, what should we be proclaiming to others? How should my life change? How should I try to steer other people that way? People who maybe don't even have doubts, but many, many, many of them do. So my interest at present is involvement in ministry based on the truth of the resurrection.
Mm. That's incredible. I mean, I know you know this, but you've spent your life defending the resurrection is a kind of ministry. But I know you mean applying this and living this out in relationships, which of course is the fourth volume, which we'll come to. I love that. Can't wait to talk about it. One of the appendixes in the back of volume 1, you have on near-death experiences. You and I have never talked about this. I've done a number of shows on this. I was a skeptic for a while, but I read that with great interest. So I'm really curious. You were one of the first evangelicals I'm aware of that was really studying near-death experiences in your book with JP at least a couple plus decades ago. How strong do you think the evidence is? How much has it increased over time? And what does it contribute to resurrection studies?
Well, maybe the best way I could say how strong is it is that I wrote an essay in two of my three big essays are with um, a secular book, and one was the Blackwell companion to substance dualism, and I did a. You'll get a kick out of this. JP is one of my closest friends, and he was in that book, and he was editing it, and he said to me, "You know the way JP talks, dude. You're the only empirical chapter in the book, okay? All of us are struggling to get some philosophical ideas across, but you got the empirical angle. Don't blow it." That's what he said to me.
I love it.
Before I did that chapter.
I love it.
So I did that. I think 2016 it came out, and I referred to 300 evidential cases. Then I wrote a second one for Discovery Institute Press, Dembski and Meyer and all those guys, Intelligent Design. That's out now. That's a book defending dualism. And I said to my editor, who's one of the intelligent design guys, he's a physicist. His name's on the book, editor. And I said to him, look, I think we know each other pretty well. I said, I'm going to make a comment. You feel free to disagree. But I said, I love intelligent design. I love fine tuning. But I'm going to say the evidence for near-death experiences is at least as strong as either of those, maybe stronger. Now, today, I wrote my third involved essay on NDEs, and it goes in another version of Blackwell, and it hasn't come out yet. But in there, I go from mentioning 300 evidential cases, and I think 2016, to 500 evidential cases now for NDEs. And some of them, Sean, if I were the skeptic, and I spent enough of my life as a skeptic, I used to debate Christians, and I spent enough of my time thinking that way. I couldn't get out of it if somebody asked me. To me, intelligent design and fine tuning, they're a little more open-ended. But NDEs are like them, and that they're not an argument from Christianity. It's an argument from natural revelation. But if it happens, here's the relationship with the resurrection. If there's an afterlife, I think it's so incredibly likely from NDEs alone, although my last essay gave 4 different arguments for an afterlife. If there's an afterlife, then critics have 2 major problems. Often they're defending naturalism or materialism without proof for their view. Bertrand Russell said he can't prove God doesn't exist. They don't have a backup for their view. And yet they make fun of anybody who believes in God, miracles, afterlife, the Bible, anything. They can't defend their view. And I want to see them blow away the NDE argument. And if they can't, then you have an afterlife. And here's my argument. I say it in that appendix. If there's an afterlife, you as a critic have to be more open to my argument for the resurrection, because the resurrection is a specific sub-argument within the category called afterlife. So that's why I use it to get to, there is life after death. Let me tell you the best case for it. That's the 1-2 punch from NDEs to resurrection.
Folks, if you're watching this and you're thinking, all right, I want you to go do a deep dive with Gary and go into some of these 500 sources, let us know, comment below. We could have him back and go into depth on that one. But that makes sense. In the class I teach on the resurrection, Gary, I give a section on near-death experiences, and I say this tells us that life continues beyond the grave. We're not material, and it gets us closer to a resurrection, open to it, certainly not to Jesus being God of the resurrection, but it's piece of a more cumulative case. So I actually frame it very, very similarly. So let us know, folks, if you want Gary back to talk about that. Let's shift to another topic I know you've written on, the Shroud of Turin. What's your take on the latest scholarship tied to that, and how does that potentially help resurrection scholarship?
That's a yes and no. I would much rather you bring the NDEs over toward the resurrection than the Shroud, even though the Shroud would not be, if it's what a lot of people claim, it's not an argument for natural revelation. It's an argument for Jesus rising from the dead. So it would be closer to home. Okay, I asked my editor, should I put an appendix in volume 1 on evidence for the Shroud? And he said, look, he said, here's my view. He said, it ballooned into such an incredible topic today. I think people will be reviewing your book. They'll be talking about the Shroud, not about the resurrection. He said, you're less sure about the resurrection, you are about the less sure of the Shroud than you are about the resurrection. I said, exactly. Then you're using a lesser argument. So now you're addressing attention to a lesser argument. And he said, and there's a lot of people who's going to go off on the Shroud who wouldn't necessarily go off on the resurrection. So now critics have already written a couple of reviews, and they'll say things like, one guy said, he mentions the Shroud in volume 1. I forgot what it was. He mentions it 32 times. Sorry. I mentioned it most likely in endnotes where I'll say, and if the Shroud is Jesus's, this adds an argument against this view, or whatever it is I'm talking about. But I do not have a section on the Shroud anywhere in the 3 volumes. The latest arguments, critics have a lot of the criticism has been toned down in recent years, in my opinion. Ever since the carbon-14 was blown up a few years ago, and it was blown up severely in 2 or 3 ways. But the main way was a group of 4 scholars, 2 in statistics and 1 in textile expert. And the main author had done an article years ago for a prestigious journal called, it was on the minimal facts of the Shroud of Turin, which is really creative. And these guys, what they did, the 2 PhDs in statistics, they said they filed a Freedom of Information Act a few years ago. It took them a couple years to get the laboratories and the dates. And the dates were all over the map. And you think, well, how did they get that medieval date? Well, you can't use the dates and back it up. So I guess we had the guy at our school. I got to hear the guy. We heard him speak, and Mike Licona and I knew him a long time before because he asked for permission to use minimal facts of the Shroud. I think the way it happened was this. The PhDs in statistics said, look, this is a huge faux pas. You've got dates. And if the dates are legit, and there's a lot of arguments against that, but we're going to let that go. If the dates are legit, you don't average dates to get an average date. That's not how we do stats. And the article was accepted by the Oxford Journal And that, I think, the journal, that either the editor or the journal itself was one of the ones that gave a report for the 1988 carbon-14 Shroud
Great.
as a fake test. So
Huh.
the editor thought, the editor at least thought, this is a good comeback, and it's been out there. And the the 88. If somebody says the 88 argument ends it and doesn't mention what's happened, uh, they're just parodying something and not reading the data, because it's a
Mm.
substantive critique that it goes like this in one sentence: we don't know what the date is, but it sure isn't the one you guys came up with.
All right, so let me lean into this one a little bit. You can obviously answer however you want to. I heard you, gosh, maybe a decade plus on Standard Reason talk about the Shroud, and I think if I remember, you're like, I'm about 80% sure it's confident, but it goes back and forth. How
Yeah.
you said you're more confident in the resurrection than the Shroud. How would you place your level of confidence, whether it's a number, a letter, just an adjective, and how would you place your confidence in the Shroud?
I still use that same line, and it aggravates people because I some of the people in the Shroud crowd, as they call themselves, uh, consider me as one of their people. Now I just turned down speaking at their big conference, so I don't run in those circles so much. But
Mm.
they'll say to me, one thing bothers me about you. Why did you say you're about 80% on the Shroud? I mean, that's a C. Actually, I only teach PhD courses, and a C in a PhD course is flunking. So 80 is not, I know that's not a good comparison, but a C is nothing to brag about. 80 is nothing to brag about. And then I make the comment that makes them bothered. I'll say, where I am on the Shroud depends what side of the bed I get up in the morning, or if it's a nice day out. And they just go, oh, come on. But here's why I'm trying to be real honest about this. The Shroud, any kind of inductive argument can only be true probabilistically. Anybody who studies inductive arguments know that. And but the Shroud is more empirical than most topics. Okay, fine. But what happens if somebody can make? There's been a lot of attempts to fake the Shroud scientifically. What happens if somebody hits a home run? Now, my first response philosophically goes like this: just because there's a possible way to do this doesn't doesn't get very far saying we know this is the way they did it. That's a non sequitur. That
Yeah.
argument's a non sequitur. But if somebody can fake it, that would reduce my thoughts. And if somebody would push it and then find out that this was used in Nice, you know, France or Italy or somewhere back then, somebody did some, I know that I'm around the corner from letting this thing go down from 80. So I have to be open. But I will tell you right now, most of the tests that are mostly done in Italian universities with laser, laser technology, physicists, I mean, really well trained people, by far today, there's a bunch of different ways to get to the fact that the image on the Shroud is apparently a scorch from a dead body that was crucified, and compares favorably to all the ways Jesus was crucified.
Mm.
Now, by the way, somebody just said recently, all right, fine. So it looks like a scorch, body crucified, looks like it could be Jesus. All right, here's my conclusion. They crucified some poor soul, made him exactly like Jesus, as nearly as they could get it from the Gospels. And we don't know how the image got there. We still have the same old problem. We don't know how the image got there, but it could have been a crucified person other than Jesus. And and my comeback is, of the 10 major pro arguments for the authenticity of the Shroud that can't be explained presently, the problem is doing it that way with some poor soul that they crucified isn't going to explain any of the evidences, because they
Mm.
can't. The evidence is frequently, as one of the Shroud team said to me years ago, they contradict physics. They seem to contradict physics. What's on the cloth? And so to say they killed this guy and did it, you're going to have all the same contradictions.
Mm.
So I think the Shroud's got a good case. Frankly, if you ask me this one, Of the two, even though NDEs don't get to Christianity, they only get to afterlife. I'd take NDEs over the Shroud. I'm probably going to get some letters on that now, but some of the
Well,
Shroud card some of them are kind of sensitive about when you're saying things about the Shroud. So I say, folks, I'm still on the pro Shroud side. I'm not afraid to say that. And people who go off on it, you could tell from their writing that they generally haven't read very deeply.
hmm. That's helpful. I have not done a full show on the Shroud. Folks, if you want to bring Gary on and do a show on the Shroud or have someone else on, comment below, and I would consider that. Even though I teach on the resurrection, I've never done a program on it in any depth. Let me know if you want me to cover it. One critic wrote this, and I think this is in relation to your second volume, Gary. I put on X and I put on some other areas questions for you about this. And someone asked why you didn't address the cognitive dissonance theory in your second volume, where you specifically have naturalistic hypotheses. Couldn't find it in the subject index. Well, in the third volume, you address it in a different way, how other scholars respond to it. So you do address cognitive dissonance, but more importantly, if you had 2 or 3 kind of criticisms for that view, and maybe just clarify for people going, what exactly is a cognitive dissonance naturalistic hypothesis? And what are maybe a couple of reasons why you just don't find it compelling?
Yeah, that's one of the main reasons I didn't cover it in very much detail in volume 2. And I will say that in volume 3, I've got pro and con scholars. Most scholars by far don't like it. It's not a very popular theory.
Mm.
Somebody throws it in when they can't make the swoon theory work, or they can't make hallucinations work, or they can't make the big boys work. They throw it in like I got my fingers crossed that you haven't heard this one before. They don't say that, but they go, yeah, what about cognitive dissonance by so and so in 1970s and this whatever. I don't consider it a major theory. Now, here's a little definition. Cognitive dissonance can even be true. It's not, I don't know anybody who argues it can't be the case, but it doesn't describe the resurrection. Cognitive dissonance is a view that is often applied to the Seventh-day Adventists or the Jehovah's Witnesses or groups like that who made prophecies. The famous one, what was it, 1844 for the Seventh-day Adventists, and they sold their goods. You can help me there, Sean. Didn't they go out in the mountain in white garments and wait for Jesus to return? And he didn't come, but they sold their homes and they
Mm.
sold everything. And what happened when Jesus did return? Well, then almost always the move will be, we refigured the numbers. It's next month. Okay, great. We'll do it next month. So you go and do it next month, and he still doesn't return. So we would think these people would turn and walk away, right? Well, many of them did. But cognitive dissonance says, no, some of them bore down and got even more radical and said, oh, well, we said Jesus was going to return. We misinterpreted return. What really happened was he entered into the Holy of Holies in heaven and gave a sacrifice for us. So 44 is still a key date in our history. Or JWs know. I just heard somebody say the other day, Jehovah's Witness expert, who said there's been something like 50, a large number of false prophecies. Like Jesus is supposed to come in the 1800s, he was supposed to come in 1914. What you got in 1914 was a world war, not a return of Jesus. And even I have an article in my file from one of the major news magazines in the world. It's not religious at all, and they gave a prediction that the Armageddon was going to begin in early 70s, and the whole world was going to be in a great conflict. I mean, Jesus is going to return, and it didn't happen. See, and in most of those cases, dissonance theory says that many of these people, they shouldn't say most, but many of these people return to the faith with a new interpretation and a greater depth of faith.
Mm.
So maybe the disciples were like pretty good believers before Jesus died, but then Jesus died and they were shut behind closed doors. Gospel of John says the men were hiding for fear of the Jews. So they're in a bad state, despair, depression, everything. But then out of the ashes, somebody breaks forth with this. Maybe he's alive in heaven, like Jesus took his blood into the Holy of Holies. maybe Jesus went to heaven and took his blood with him, or maybe and they'll think of something. And then when the disciples went out, and you're the guy that wrote the book on how many of them were martyred, and of course we know that for the big three, Paul and James, the brother of Jesus, and Peter, we have first century references for the martyrdoms of all three, and you defend some qualified comments on the others. So it's a little bit hard. I think cognitive dissonance just doesn't have an. If you're going to make it a side category and you're going to say, oh, this big theory that explains everything can do it, and we know what those would be, again, hallucination, whatever, so on. And then you want to say, oh, in sub-argument, in dissonance, sometimes people get more excited, so that would maybe help us understand their transformations. But it doesn't explain how Jesus died or didn't die on the cross. That creed in 1 Corinthians 15 with the Jesus seminar says either the parts of it or the whole creed predate Paul's walk to Damascus. I mean, that's first 2 to 3 years. Is that creed in 1 Corinthians 15 with the appearance of the 500? And but dissonance by itself, I don't think it's going to get us to first base. I just don't think it's a good theory. Just because some people go back off the mountain and are more dedicated to their faith doesn't mean their faith is true. And it is true that many of them left. When Sabbatai Tzvi, when the famous Jewish prophet figure, when the Muslims captured him and put him under house arrest, they told him to go out and tell the crowd, you're not the Messiah. And he went out and he told the crowd, I've just had a vision from God, and I'm not the Messiah. Then they said, hey, one more small thing. Go tell the crowd to convert to Islam. And he went out and told the crowd to convert to Islam. And you say, well, see, he wasn't willing to die for his faith. And later he died, I believe, under house arrest. So there's the opposite kind of cases. And Sabbatai Tzvi is huge. But he walked away. He changed the whole thing, including you guys become Muslims. So we don't see that with the apostles. Their faith was so deep by comparison. The minimal facts are all firm. I don't see anything, to those attempts.
And of course, a couple of the known facts that would be a particular problem, even if you got the disciples, would be what cognitive dissonance did Paul have? What cognitive dissonance did James have? Either you've got to.
How does cognitive dissonance empty the tomb?
There you go. That's one thing Craig said in his response. He said it doesn't explain the appearances. It doesn't explain the empty tomb.
Right.
At best, the origin of the Christian way. And I think you're right. There are examples historically of cognitive dissonance and people sticking with the belief when proven wrong.
That's right.
You've got to map that onto the resurrection and explain why it's the best for the known facts.
That's right.
That's where I think it falls short.
I guess in a sentence, it explains far too little. Yes, there are some cases, but it explains far too little and doesn't get to first base with the minimal facts.
All right, Gary, you can pass on this one if you don't want to respond. Of course, you can pass on all of them. But imagine we said, all right, I'm going to defend the resurrection, and you're going to be the critic, and you and I are going to have a debate. So in other words, you have to pick a naturalistic theory. Which one, if you were forced, would you pick and why? And then, of course, I'm going to ask your critique of it. But I'm curious, after all this resurrection study, if you just came to the conclusion God doesn't exist and Christianity is not true, which one do you think you would pick?
Yeah, I get asked this once in a while, and I would probably go, I hate to say this because Sean, with doubters, there are people who tend towards certain psychological beliefs, obsessive compulsive disorder or anxiety disorders. And when you give a theory, they hear your theory. They don't hear your refutations. They don't hear them, and they get all worked up when they hear the theory. If you want me to do one, I've been asked this before, and I'll do it. But I am leery of people hearing only this one thing, and worried so much they don't hear the rest of the responses. But I would take some version of hallucinations. However, as the data go on, I think hallucinations are getting worse, and they were never great. but I think hallucinations are getting worse and worse as it goes on, not better. Today, um, there's a reason why a number of people who used to hold or lean toward hallucinations say, I'm not going to take a naturalistic theory anymore. And two of the big proponents of just one theory. See, ask yourself this question. How many big name scholars do you know who take one naturalistic theory and they're willing to go down with the ship? They'll go down with the Titanic if you sink this theory. And two of them died in the last few years, and there's almost none of the big names who are doing it. One is Garrett Ludeman, who took hallucination, and one is John Shelby Spong, who is not your critic's critic, but he's more pastoral. He's but in his duties, but he did teach a course on the resurrection, I understand, at Harvard Divinity School. So, and he took this it's been called the Peter's happy hunch theory, this intuitive theory. Yeah, but what I mean is those two went down with the ship. They went down with the Titanic. But today, more and more critics are saying, I don't know what happened. Now they've been saying that for decades, but I don't know what happened, and I'm not going to pick any one theory. And here's the most common response. Sean, I might use this one because this is better than a single theory where you can nail them with the refutations.
Okay.
I would, and it's not a naturalistic theory, so I wouldn't be answering your question. But I think the most common theory today is this: you guys are so silly. There are no supernatural things in the world. There's no miracles. There's no evidence for anything. No double-blind prayer experiments. None of this. None of that. People aren't seeing this and being raised from the dead and all that kind of stuff. There's no supernatural world. So I don't care what evidence you're going to give. All I'll tell you is it's not a resurrection because those things don't happen in this world. In other words, it's a view that assumes naturalism or materialism and won't listen to any other views, as opposed to one that uses a view. And that's why, by the way, I'll just say this, and you can hop on it. I'd love you to. At the end of volume 2, I have an appendix on, is naturalism true? Is naturalism or materialism true? And the big thing is, you can't prove them. I mean, Bertrand Russell said that, and a number of the major scholars today are saying you can't prove naturalism or materialism. So when someone says to me, that's not the way the world is, I go, time out. Let's just stop. You've asked me for evidence for the resurrection. I'm just making something up. I gave you 10 or whatever. I don't hear a single evidence for your materialism / naturalism. Let me just stop, let you have the floor, and give me 10 reasons of similar strength for why naturalism and materialism are true. That's good. And you know what they usually say? They'll say, oh, I don't have any burden to prove that. I only say I'm not a theist. Okay, fine. But if you can't prove your view, don't use it against my view and against my reasons when you have none. And I always cite Bertrand Russell because he says for a theist, you need God and an afterlife. Then he says for Christians, you need God, the afterlife, and something nice about Jesus. This sentence is real funny. Something nice about Jesus. You have to at least believe that he was a pretty good guy. That's what Russell says. But then he's asked, they say, well, can you disprove God? And he goes, no, you can't disprove God. Thank you, Bertrand Russell, who, before he died, he was probably better known than Antony Flew as the best known philosophical atheist in the world. So if you can't show naturalism's true, shut your mouth, quit running your mouth and say there's no such thing like your view, because I can give you double-blind prayer experiments that have been written up in non-Christian medical journals. I can give you cases of healing today that have been done scientifically. I can do that. We can talk about NDEs. We can talk about the possibility of the Shroud of Turin. I'm giving you reasons. Don't sit there and just go, no, that's stupid. And don't think you have to do a thing. I'm sorry. If you can't prove your view, this conversation's over. So that's probably the one I would go with, was the naturalism. But if you want to go with the naturalistic theory, I don't like hallucination at all, but I'd take a view of it, probably an angle on hallucination.
Fair enough. Well, you have a 50-page response and 9 points you draw out why you're not convinced by hallucination, and then objective visions and illuminations. Yes. I mean, you go on in your second volume. So I was just really more curious about that. Even before he said that, I would have taken more of a methodological approach to just skepticism about miracles, more so than arguing the facts,
Yeah,
is probably what I would
yeah.
take. But fair enough. Uh, in volume one,
That's
you list what
that's
you.
that's very close to the one I did about just become a naturalist or an materialist and say I don't have to give reasons because it'll stump people.
Mm,
And don't let them get to first, don't let the Christians get to first base. Just say, I don't even want, this is horrible. This conversation is going nowhere. And I would say, yeah, it's going nowhere because you don't have any evidence for your view.
mm.
So
Tell me a little bit about at the beginning of volume one, you talk about the minimal facts. And I think most people watching this are familiar that these are facts that you would argue are strongly evidenced. And for the vast majority of them, say typically 90% plus agreement on them, such as the crucifixion of Jesus. The disciples report that they believe Jesus had risen from the grave, the
right.
conversion of Paul, etc. And you list some what you consider strengths for this. What do you think are the potential weaknesses of the minimal facts method?
Well, one thing oh, by the way, one thing I got to mention at the beginning, I get asked in interviews, they'll say, yeah, but you're the guy that says these facts are at least 90% allowed by critics. People, I've said this to people, and they've tried to disprove me and look in my books, and then they admit they can't find it. I never say a fact has to be admitted by 90% of scholars before it can count as a minimal fact. The numbers may be that high, but that's different from saying they have to be that high before I'll use them. I don't make that criterion.
Okay.
Um, and but uh, if I were to make a critique of this, boy, you're asking these, play the devil's advocate. If I were to make a critique, I think I would say this. I think I would stay away from trying to do refutations because they are allowed by the top guys. Dale Allison says, I admit the minimal facts. And then he says, but here's some questions you have to ask. All right. So I would go the questions route that he does. And I would say, facts, if they are facts, let's just concede that these are historical facts. They are historical facts, but historical facts are not interpretations. There are facts and there are interpretations. If I'm the critic, I'll say, I'll allow the facts, but I won't allow the interpretation you give.
Mm,
And then I want to know how well their interpretation fits with the data. And they might come up with something that that can make some sense of the facts. But often when they do this, I like this when they do this in a debate because um, the interpretations are usually silly. They're usually off the subject. I mean, for example, I had a guy just argue with me just recently, a world class scholar, just argue with me recently, and he said, why does God raising Jesus mean his teachings are true? That's an interpretation, and that's your view. Yes, that's my view. It's also the view of a lot of people who are not even conservative. Wolfhart Pannenberg, back when he wrote, he denied the empty tomb, he denied bodily nature of the appearances. And I was just reading him today on how he says for the Jew, if God raised Jesus, it's a shut and closed case. Jesus was whatever he claimed. And so they can give their own alternative views. But I want to hear, then the debate's going to be about their interpretation. I'd love to hear their interpretation because
mm,
I don't think they'll get to first base. But I would try to draw a distinction between facts. I don't think you're going to make it going against the facts. It's that strong, and there's so many people who don't believe who concede the facts. I think that you got to say the facts don't prove it. And again, you go, well, how would they do that? I already gave an example, and you followed up with your version of it, how you do it. Um, if they say, yeah, but there's no supernatural world. So you lose me when you say resurrection because no resurrections happen. They're not in the world. There's no miracles. You can't prove it. There's nothing in black and white, no photographs, no whatever. So I don't know what the answer is, but it's not yours.
mm,
And then I would go piece by piece and say, give me a better theory. You say, I already did. Yeah, but here's the problem. You can't prove naturalism or materialism. And if you can't prove your underlying view is true, don't use the view that you can't or won't prove to argue against mine with evidences,
mm,
empirical evidences.
mm. So I asked you this in a different conversation, but I'm curious if you've thought about it anymore. And what your take is, there's a lot of graduate students and apologists who want to keep writing on the resurrection. And I'm wondering what areas you think people might still be able to contribute to. And I ask because for me, work on the apostles, published it, did a
Yeah,
10-year update where I nuanced some stuff, but there's still some questions like in Thomas, is the Acts of Thomas independent of some of the oral traditions that come from the South, for example? And untangling that, some of the traditions really could answer the question whether we have one source or two. And there's some work that could be done there. What would you
sure.
say on the resurrection as a whole, areas that could still be developed, or suggestions to others who want to keep doing research here, or if you think we've made the case?
Well, I think I made the case in the alley that I was traveling in, which is to say,
Mm.
all the evidence says it happened. Naturalistic theories don't work. The third volume says here's whatever it is, 600-ish scholars, um, and their pros and cons with almost no apologetic argumentation. And the last one says, volume 4 is split in two. How does the resurrection ground Christian theism? And secondly, how does it ground Christian practice? For sure, I would think what I did in the last volume, it's the shortest volume.
Oh,
Manuscript wise, it was only like 740 pages. And they reminded me that the head editor there at Brabant Home, and I said, "Yeah, my fourth volume's not going to be as fat as the other ones." And he said, "I just remind you, in your contract from years ago, you told us that volume 4 wouldn't be as big." So I was glad he
nice.
remembered that. But I think there's a reason my volume 4 takes two topics, which is Christian worldview from the resurrection and practice, pastoral practice. It takes two whole uh, big subjects, and it's shorter than the other ones. What does that tell you? I think that tells you some very sophisticated people in arguments for God, in arguments against pain and suffering, in arguments for the overall Christian view would tighten up the resurrection. I think some I do mention the shroud a lot, but in a different way. I don't defend it, but I do think the stronger the case gets for the shroud, it's good. I think that more people that take NDEs, you're not going to get to Jesus from NDEs, I don't think.
Mm.
Um, but but uh, the stronger that case becomes, the stronger foothold we have on which we build the resurrection argument. And I think so. I think more needs to do on Christian worldview. That's the first half of volume 4. And I think a lot more could be done on Christian practice,
Mm.
ways pastors can take the resurrection. And I deal with about 8 topics there, like doubt. Um, what do you say at a funeral? What do you say to someone who's lost a loved one? Uh, what about the resurrection and
Mm.
sin? I got a portion on that. Resurrection and sin, resurrection and heaven. I asked the question, what do we know about heaven? If all we know about heaven are data about the resurrection, just from the resurrection, what do you know about heaven? A lot of those topics can be developed a lot more. I think they could be developed by people who are counselors. The first group by people who are specialists in God's existence and people that spent their whole life doing that. So I think
Mm.
that there's more things to do. And you go, well,
Good.
yeah, but they use the resurrection, but they're not the resurrection. Well, I say the deeper the resurrection question becomes, the stronger the overall product will be.
Mm.
So, and people talk about inspiration, and there's a big discussion now about what's inerrancy and everything else. I just remind people we have the case for the resurrection before the first New Testament book was written, so it's out there.
Mm.
It's out there very, very early in the creeds. The creeds is a great topic to go on. Build a case of the
Okay.
resurrection? Use only the creeds that we can reasonably date before First Thessalonians in 50 A.D. and maybe in the 30s A.D. So any of those, people could take what I take and do a better job on some of those things. So
That's great. Love it. You last time we talked, you said a book. I was just looking around here for it. I couldn't about a Jew who examined the resurrection and then became convinced
Yeah.
that it was true. In
Yes.
your scholarship, how many Jewish scholars that are not messianic, that don't believe in Jesus, engage this evidence, respond to this evidence, or do most of them just not even deal with it and consider it?
I think given the number of Jewish scholars who work close to this, where resurrection could come into something they're saying, um, not very many do it. Now,
Mm.
there is a book published years ago, a doctoral dissertation on Jewish views on resurrection, and and about there's about three scholars listed in there who are pretty positive to resurrection. Pinchas Lapid is very well known because he
Uh-huh.
affirms the resurrection. He called himself a Pharisee. He affirms resurrection of the body, and yet he gives an intriguing reason as to why he doesn't need to become a Christian, even though Jesus was raised from the dead. And basically, he takes a view of a guy named Franz Rosenzweig, who around the turn of the 1900s was a very famous intellectual German Jew, if I remember correctly. And Rosenzweig's view goes like this: um, Jesus is the Messiah of the Gentiles. He's the Gentile Messiah. He's not the Jewish Messiah. And Jews come through the law because that's the Old Testament and they're God's people. They are exempted. They come through the law, but everybody else in the world comes through Jesus Christ.
Mm.
And he gives us kind of this idea. It's a pretty high view when you think about it, because like 40 million people in the world are exempted from billions and billions. But Lapid does that. Geza Vermesh was professor of Jewish studies at Oxford, and Vermesh was a Christian for a while, and then walked away from, went back to Judaism.
Mm.
And he says in his little book of Resurrection that he wrote a short time before he died, he it's hard to get where he is. It's hard to see where he is. He refutes naturalistic theories. He gives positive evidences for the resurrection, and then I think he says, I'm agnostic. And even that
Interesting.
you got to read between the lines. This uh, last fellow I was referring to is a professor of theology at the seminary at Seton Hall University. So he got a major position, and he was not just thoroughly Jewish from an Orthodox background, but he was a Jewish skeptic. He he went off on religion as a whole, and he debated Jews, he debated Christians, he debated everybody. And then when he studied, it's really what got him was the creeds and the minimal facts. I don't mean mine. I don't
Sure.
mean he cites me and cites him, but that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying he uses a group of facts that fit the same criteria
Mm.
with the creeds, and he says this is. Oh, by the way, something in that book, there's a little bit of a return to Isaiah 53 as the text that 1 Corinthians 15 does in the Creed when Paul says he died for our sins according to the scriptures, buried, and rose again from the dead according to the
Mm.
scriptures. And for years, people said, nah, the old Jewish commentaries, you don't get anything in Isaiah 53. A few of the old books, a few of the books are saying that Isaiah 53 does figure in Jewish thinking.
Mm.
And that's an exciting, by the way, that's something that more work could be done on.
Oh, there you
What what
go.
is the text? What is the text in 1 Corinthians 15 when Paul says Paul's saying it, but it's not his creed. He says he that uh, I delivered to you that which I received. Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, buried, rose again he rose again, appeared, and twice he repeats according to the scriptures. But
Yeah.
I'm asking, what's the one for the atonement? Died for our sins according to the scriptures. What scripture is that? And that's a really interesting question. Hey, and another one that people are working on for doctoral dissertations, the so-called Q comment that's
Oh,
in Matthew and in Luke about the prediction that Jesus made about rising from the dead. That the rising part is not in Luke; it's in Matthew, but the rest of it's there. And dissertations have been written on whether Luke knew that and whether he didn't put it in for some reason. But that whole thing about that text alone is big. The Acts sermon summaries, which are another species of creed, The Acts sermon summaries, Acts 1 through 5, 10, 13, and maybe 17, contain major passages from the early years. Some scholars say it's the earliest creedal material of all, and resurrection's in every one of them.
Mm. I remember you saying that. I went through that very carefully in some of my work, just to be confident that the apostles believed Jesus had risen and it was a part of the kerygma. And it's remarkable how it's just like a golden thread through the book of Acts and in all of
It
their
is.
speeches. So that's
It is.
pretty remarkable. Do you have a sense of where historical Jesus and or resurrection scholarship is headed? Any kind of trajectories of where it might be going different from in the past? Or are you like, Sean, I'm not a prophet and I can't make any predictions or sense of
No,
where it's
I wouldn't
going?
make predictions, but I will tell you something that has already happened. That's already in the works. I was challenged. I referred to a person earlier, a nameless person, a very well trained person teaching at a very major university overseas, and he wrote to me and he's challenging me on some things. One of the things he said was, I cited Raymond Brown's intro to Christology, written 94, I believe, 1994, just before he died, Raymond Brown. And Raymond Brown gives five views where New Testament scholars line up. And he argues that the most popular view, the best attested view, is what he calls moderate conservatism. So the Christology is moderately conservative. Now, I will just mention on the side, John A.T. Robinson, who before he died, he was called the God is Dead theologian in the 60s. I think that's false, but he's not conservative. He gives four views and also decides for the conservative view that is the most influential one. So Robinson and Brown, certainly two big views. So this guy challenged me and he goes, "You think the third quest has gone further to the right from Brown and Robinson?" And I said, "It certainly has. It certainly has." And he said, "Why don't you give me some sources?" Okay, I'll give you a couple of quickies. These are big Christology works. Now we always have Hurtado and Bauckham, but
Yeah.
we've already gone past them a little bit. And Petrie's book that just came out on the with Erdman's on the D.D. Price, he says what I'm going to say next. A guy named David Capes, who is maybe the authority on Paul using the word Yahweh for Jesus over and over. Romans 10:9 is a great example because it's a creed. It has the whole gospel in it, and he uses the word for Yahweh. So this is a very high Christology of Jesus as Yahweh. Well, Petrie and Capes, and now I list in this. I'm doing it right now, volume 4. I'm editing it, and I just realized again that volume 4 lists 3 more sources where people are saying right now what's called the early high Christology view. That it's the view that Bauckham cites it, but Bauckham isn't the first one. The earliest Christology is the highest Christology.
Love it.
That comment, it is the comment that the Christology of 30 to 40, or if you prefer, 33 to 43, whatever year you think Jesus was born, the earliest Christology is higher than the Christology in the Gospel of John. You go, really? Well, yeah, because John calls him Theos, but the early creeds call him Yahweh. Just for one pointer. But my point is that Petrie and Capes for sure, and then one or two of the other guys say, ready? The predominant Christology today is the high Christology movement. It's the most prominent view today among critical scholars. Now, if you're going to talk about Yahweh and Jesus, and then you're going to team it up with the resurrection, I mean, brother, this you got NDEs at the other end. What I'm saying is, we'll go all the way from deity to resurrection to heaven. We'll go all the way to heaven there, and it's the hottest thing right there. Try to refute the NDEs, try to refute the resurrection, and if not just high Christology, not just good Christology, Hurtado and Bauckham and some other. By the way, Bauckham's in this too about the predominant view. If it's the hottest view today, I'm going to argue that out of the third quest for the historical Jesus, the third quest has spawned this high Christology view.
Mm. That's
So
really
I think that's hot, hot, hot. And when you put it with resurrection, where guys are backing off naturalistic theories and saying, "Well, I'm not going to take one anymore. I'm just going to say those things don't happen today," and you go, "Time out. I'm done with this unless you can defend naturalism and prove naturalism is true. If you can't, my view is stand out there in the field because your view is not out there because you don't have any evidence for it."
Mm.
So I think this is the most exciting time. Sean, I'm 10 years past retirement, humanly speaking. I'm still full time at Liberty. But I say to people, it would be really nice if I could know, I wouldn't trade where my research is today. If I could have all the research I've done and know everything I know, I would be pleased if the Lord would start me again at age 35.
Mm.
I would like a second life to give for the gospel.
Mm. That.
So, but we have to train. We have to train the Ben Shaws and the guys that are coming up right now, that are just they're at that age. Hey, listen, I just got a letter from a guy. It so touched my heart. This father writes to me on behalf of his son. His son is obviously a brilliant fellow. He's 15 years old, and he just sat down and wrote a 220-page book on the resurrection.
I
And they
read it.
wrote to me and
Me
told
too.
me, "Oh,
Yep.
you know who you know what
Yep.
I'm talking about?
Yep. I
How
endorsed
did
it.
you
I
like it?"
saw he sent me your uh notes, like your endorsement. He forwarded it to me and I read it and was like, wow. And this is a homeschool kid and
Yep.
just they did not use AI, wrote it himself, understood the arguments, explained it. I was thinking at 15, there's zero chance I could have done this. So I'm with you.
Am
That
I
was
right?
cool.
It's over 200 pages, right?
I don't remember the page count, but it was significant and it was long. It was a big
Yeah. No.
project.
Let me let me tell you what I wrote back to him. I said, when I was starting to study the resurrection, didn't know anything about it when I first read that comment. If it's true, then his teachings are true. And when I was 14, I started writing an essay on the resurrection.
Mm.
So by the time I was 15, his age, I had this essay, and I didn't write it for anybody. I wasn't trying to publish. I wasn't trying to be a scholar. I wasn't trying to say I'm going to go to college and do this. It was for my doubts. And I had a list so I wouldn't forget these things: refutation of swoon theory, refutation of hallucinations. I was writing everything I knew. When I went to college, I finished this thing when I was 15. Same thing made sense. I went to college and we had to turn an apologetics paper in for class. I went only 5 semesters to a Christian school, but
Mm.
one of them I had to do an apologetics paper. I didn't. You know how things happen. You don't get your work done in time, and I wasn't ready to hand that paper in. I handed in the paper I wrote when I was 15, and I got an A on it.
Oh, that's funny.
so, so I wrote back to the guy and I said, "I know what you're talking about. I was 15." I said, "Guess what?" I said, "You could be one of those guys coming up in the next apologetics group, and we need them because we're not going to be here forever."
Amen.
But then at the end of it, Sean, I want to say one more thing to you. I said, look at Proverbs 4, was it Proverbs 4:23, about paying the most attention to your heart because it's the most important thing. I said, most people are going to fall away for emotional reasons, not for factual reasons.
Mm.
You've done the factual reasons here. Mind your heart. And then he wrote back to me and he was so thrilled. I wrote back to him again. I said, just remember what I said. Mind your heart. Don't put all your time in the facts and none on your heart. Learn to affirm your views because I would like to, quote unquote, look down from heaven and see you as one of the sharp guys when you're 35 or 40 years old.
Amen. I love that. Well, this in some ways this is probably a good note to end on because one of the things you do a lot like my dad is you make a case for something, but you care about the heart, care about character, care about treating people kindly. I remember you talking about your interaction with Flu, which was at Cal Poly, San Luis Obispo. I was part of their Veritas this year, and they were still talking about your dialogue with
Really?
him decades ago. Oh yeah, they were mentioning it and talking about it, and we reminisced a little bit going back as just your relationship with him was a model of how to do apologetics. I love that you encourage this young man. I did the same thing. If you're watching this, we need a new generation of apologists who will make the case, carry the torch, fill in the gaps on some of the areas that Gary pointed towards. But most important is mind your heart above all else. That it's
Absolutely.
so good. I went through a period of doubt. It was intellectual and there was a big emotional component to it. It was really, really both of them. So your volume
Yeah.
3 is out. If people have not picked it up yet, it's called Scholarly Perspectives. And it's really more, probably one somebody wouldn't read through per se like the others. I read the others through, but it's a resource guide on so many issues: bodily resurrection, questions from the Gospels, known historical facts, minimal facts, and where different scholars land on them. I can't imagine the amount of time you and Ben Shaw put in to putting this together. So again, folks, get the 13.2 pounds of research, probably about 3,000 words. Check it out. Gary will do it again. Folks watching, if you want me to bring Gary back to do a show on the Shroud or near-death experiences, let me know and make sure you hit subscribe. We've got other topics on the resurrection that we will not miss. You will not want to miss those. And if you thought about studying apologetics, great program at Liberty, and we've got a great program at Talbot. We're all on the same page here. Gary, appreciate you, my friend. We'll do it again soon.
Sean, thank you so much. You're always such a fantastic interviewer, and I've done several now because those 4 books are done, and I'm going to the interviews. But when I saw yours on my book, when I turned the page in the appointment book, and I thought, fantastic, Sean's out of there this week. So I'm just glad to be with you, Sean. And the idea that you've tried to push all 3 of the volumes, I think it's just very kind of you.
Thanks, brother.
Thank you, man.